Everyone who works at Starbucks, full or part-time, gets stock in our company. Which means that when Starbucks succeeds, our people do too. At Starbucks, benefits like company stock are just the start.
Yeah, I mean, I think to me, we need to spend much more of our energy on this stuff that you and I have been talking about for the last 5 minutes and less sort of subsidizing or innovating around new business models. Can't tell you how much time and energy is spent sort of either lamenting that the business model is not what it once was, or trying to find a business model that will be what it once was. When we have the roadmaps there, we just need to execute.
This is Small Press, Big Ideas, a podcast about the business of local news in the United States. I'm your host, Paul Gewertz. Small Press, Big Ideas is about the opportunities and challenges that local news publishers are facing for their businesses. I'll sit down and talk with journalists, entrepreneurs, nonprofit leaders, and more in the local news industry to find out what's working, what isn't, and how the local news ecosystem can innovate and flourish in the 21st century. Today on the podcast, I am joined by Jonathan Kealing. Jonathan is the Chief Network Officer at the Institute for Nonprofit News, INN. Actually, I never said it out loud. The abbreviation. Is it? Okay, I thought so. INN. I invited Jonathan on after reading a piece he penned for editor and publisher a few weeks back, but I'm sure we'll get into all that in a minute. But thank you so much for being here. I appreciate you taking the time out of your day.
Thanks for having me, Paul, and for giving me a chance to talk about the piece and just about the future of local journalism in general. It's a time of great transition, but I think there's reasons for hope if we keep on the path, or if we keep pursuing improvement in everything that we're doing.
I agree. That's why I've got the podcast here. I feel the exact same way. But before we dive into that, I'd love to just give myself and the audience just a brief bio on your career and kind of maybe the winding path you took to winding up at the INN. I'd love to hear that.
Yeah. So, I started as a reporter, like I think most journalists do, covering primarily higher education in the state of Kansas. I was working at a really forward-thinking media company that at the time was written up in the New York Times as the newspaper of the future. Spoiler alert, didn't quite work out as well as they hoped back in those heady days of the early 2000s. Nevertheless, it was a great place to start my career and cut my teeth in a place where good journalism married smart technology and a lot of resources from a dedicated family ownership, gave us the ability to try new things and push new boundaries. So, I was a reporter working primarily for a newspaper, but I also, did packages for TV, recorded podcasts for the website. I was a real multimedia jack of all trades. And then the company started selling pieces of itself off, and I kind of could see the writing on the wall and started looking for somewhere else to go, and I wound up in public media. I was a senior editor, deputy editor, director of digital, ultimately executive editor for digital at a major national public radio company, working in national and international news primarily, and got a sense for just what it means to work in a nonprofit setting, not have a paywall, not have subscriptions, but ask people to support your work because of the value that they see in it, not because they have to. I worked, there for a number of years in different roles, and then spent several months working on a merger between PRI and PRX, and then left there and went to INN, basically on the strength of a conversation about the potential for this relatively new field of primarily digital, nonprofit, startup news organizations that were doing something differently, that were, had a different business model, had a different approach. And it's been a great ride, I guess, for the last almost 7 years since, just a chance to be on the front lines with news organizations that are trying to do something different.
Very cool. I don't know much about the history of the INN. That's probably a whole separate podcast.
Yeah.
But just like even in your posts, when you mentioned some of the founding members, MinnPost, Wisconsin Watch, Texas Tribune, some awesome publications in there. I know some folks at a few of them. It's really cool. You kind of wound up there through your.
Yeah, it is. And, I've been an admirer of those organizations that you rattled off, Texas Tribune, ProPublica, MinnPost. I mean, since long before I came to INN. And so the opportunity to come here and work with those people has been just a real joy, and a chance to help take those lessons and carry them forward, but also help those organizations propel themselves forward toward the future as well.
Awesome. Great stuff. Very cool. So I do want to get into the piece. So I read this article you wrote for Editor and Publisher, and I think the title was, I have it written down here, Journalism Without an Audience is Just Creative Writing. And in that piece, I was just rereading it before we hopped on to, you kind of put forth some of your thoughts on the relationship between publishers and audiences is kind of what I took away from it. Could you walk us through, in the article you said that you had kind of been tossing this idea around, then you read a piece in the Prospect magazine that kind of helped you crystallize it. Could you just kind of talk us through that, like what this idea is and the origins of this article you wrote?
Yeah. So, I mean, as with anything, I think there's a lot of different threads out there. And I'd been kind of chewing on some of these threads for a long time. On the one hand, I came up in an era of digital journalism where the economics were falling out of the bottom. The industry was falling out through the bottom, but we could always make ourselves feel better by talking about how we're reaching more people than ever before, more engagement than ever before, constantly growing audiences. But what I don't know that we truly well understood at the time, I think we understand now, is that audience was always thanks to the generosity of some large platforms, Facebook, Twitter to an extent, certainly Google. And it wasn't because of, some genuine, deep and abiding passion for news that a growing portion of the population had. It was because these big platforms essentially were using news to meet their own engagement metrics because that was the best model they had at the time. Some point in the middle stages of the pandemic, Facebook decided news was no longer of interest to it. And that began what has been with, not a straight line, but sort of a generalized either stagnation or declination in audiences for news. And we see that possibly accelerating based on the development of AI and AI chatbots. And we don't see sessions with AI chatbots generating referrals the same way that a Google search session does. So over here, we have this thread about audience, which is at best stagnating and in most cases declining for the first time in my entire career, which to me is a huge issue, huge red flag. Like, what are we going to do about that? And then on the other hand, we have this sort of economic model, which admittedly, from essentially the dawn of Craigslist, the business model for news as it exists has, fallen apart. And every time I go to an industry conference, I hear a lot about, the business model and searching for a business model, finding a business model. But then when I look over the 15, 18-year arc of nonprofit news organizations, what became clear to me was that that's actually a very vibrant, functional, effective business model for supporting news. And my concern is that model is actually 15 to 18 years old. So yes, there's a period from like 2001 or 2003 through probably 2010, 2011, where realistically, we didn't know what the future business model for news is, but we're a decade and a half hence from there with an available business model, actually multiple available business models. I'm the biggest, I am most expert in the nonprofit model, but there are other models, as I say in the piece, out there that are working very effectively in Canada and California. And so my concern is, as we focused on trying to replicate either the profits or the sizes of a media industry that existed for actually just a very short period of time, maybe 40 or 50 years, we're losing track of the bigger challenge, which is audiences not consuming us. And so all these pieces kind of milling around. I read the piece in Prospect, which talked about, it had some really interesting survey data of people asking about, do they feel like they're not getting enough news? Do they feel like they don't know these things? And they don't. Like, even though objectively we know less news is being created now than was created 20 years ago, 30 years ago, people aren't missing it. And so my big concern is that while we've been trying to struggle with a business model, there's been a business model in front of us, and we've taken our eyes off the ball in terms of engaging with our audiences. And that doesn't even address the fact that for a big portion of the population has never taken their needs and interests into account. Communities of color, low wealth communities. I mean, those have historically been ignored, marginalized, or worse by the news industry. And so we're not serving our traditional news consumers well. We're not serving the next generation of news consumers well. So who are we serving? If we don't develop a deeper relationship with our communities, if we don't put communities at the center of what we do, we may have a business model, but I don't know what business we're going to be in.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. I haven't had as much experience with nonprofits, but definitely, like, I've had even some people on the podcast. They've got thriving models going on. Shout out my friend John Garrett down in Texas with Community Impact. Who else is on the podcast? There's a guy, Keith Pepper from Rough Draft Atlanta. He's done a great thing with newsletters and stuff.
I'm familiar with that.
Yeah, so they're like, the models are there, and it is working. So it does have to be, an audience thing. And I just wanted to click on a few things you said.
Sorry, I just unpacked the whole piece in the answer to your first question.
Then we'll go into more of them. That's great. It's funny how you said the news, you're looking back to it was actually a very short period where that news model actually worked, the good old days, however you want to talk about it. It reminds me a lot of the music industry, where there's a lot of these, the rock bands of like the 70s and 80s just had like private jumbo jets and stuff because they were in a very brief window also. And now that's evolved also, just similar kind of tracks.
It's roughly the same time period, essentially, from sort of the post-war baby boom type era of the 50s kind of through the dawn of the internet in the mid to late 90s.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're talking about a 40-year period. And in many ways, the period of time post-disruption is at this point today nearly as long as that period of growth,
right.
Which is, it's easy for those of us to look back and think that what it was is what it always has been, when that's not the case. And I love the connection with music because, it's absolutely.
Yeah. Yep. So I do want to caveat these questions. You did mention in the piece, I wish this was a column where I have the answers. So I know you don't have all the answers or whatever, but I'm going to ask you anyway. So there's a few.
As you should. What type of podcast host would you be if you didn't?
Right. Well, you said that there's two main priorities to grapple with. I liked this a lot. And you said, first, convincing Americans that news is a priority. I was wondering if we could talk about that a bit. Any tactical thoughts on how to do this?
I actually have a lot of technical thoughts on this one.
Yeah.
This one, tactics are fairly well defined and obvious. It just is going to take consistent work over a period of time to achieve. I was just in New Orleans for an industry conference, and I was talking with some colleagues there about philanthropy for news across the South, which, the South is a relatively rural, obviously with, exceptions for places like Atlanta and New Orleans, but, a lot of rural, historically, socioeconomically challenged. So not a place where you think that news will find a fertile ground for philanthropy. As I was talking, I said, but, when I look across New Orleans, or, when I take a drive from New Orleans into Mississippi, when I go into small towns, I see churches, like a lot of churches, and churches rely on philanthropy. And so I think what that says to me is that communities of all shapes and sizes, certainly there is a point where you get too small to support a church, and certainly there's a place where you get too small to support journalism. And at this day and age, journalism is way above the churches. But I truly believe that with enough connection and case making and utility and value, that journalism can find civic support in communities of many, many sizes where it doesn't exist today. So, to that end, how? I think one part of it is just reconnecting with communities. It is putting communities in the center of what we do. One of the things I like about the nonprofit model is it's a community ownership model. The boards of nonprofits are charged with providing community benefits. They're not charged with maximizing shareholder return. They're charged with providing benefits to their community, and their community is represented on the board of directors that runs this nonprofit. I think there are a lot of great models, but why I like the nonprofit model is because it puts the community at the center. It's not enough just to have your community members on the board. You have to actually live that value and actually meet that sort of higher purpose of providing community benefits. But that to me is, step one. Put your community at the center of what you do and ensure that the work that you're doing is providing benefits to your community. Step two is just awareness. Awareness of the values of news organizations, awareness of the standards that news organizations live up to, and then adhering to those standards. One of the things that INN does is we actually vet every news organization that applies to be part of INN. We have standards of financial transparency, editorial independence. You have to be able to see who's on the board, who's on the staff. You have to be able to connect with them because, we think that builds trust. You have to know who's funding the organization because we think that builds trust. And I think publicizing and living by those standards is another good way to deepen those relationships in communities and to help them understand the value of news. And then last but not least is just asking people for their support. I mean, we live in a GoFundMe era. Americans are incredibly generous toward causes that they feel compelled toward. But they haven't been asked historically by news organizations to support them. Maybe if they're, public radio, maybe if they grew up in the backseat of a car listening to public radio or watching Sesame Street or Mr. Rogers on public television, they've, heard a fund drive and been asked to support. But by and large, most people in this country haven't been asked to support local news, and certainly not philanthropic local news. And so we just need to be asking people. There's all sorts of research about how many times you have to ask someone before they'll say yes. And we just need to get in the habit of asking more people to make news a philanthropic priority for them all across this country. And so I truly believe that nonprofit news organizations are doing that work. But even with 500 nonprofit news organizations, there are whole swaths of this country that aren't super well served by nonprofits that may be asking people to support news. So really, it's about making that case, making the asks, showing the impact, and then carrying those relationships forward over years as people, make estate plans and make, the potential for major gifts. Nonprofit and philanthropy is a huge part of the American economy, and people are willing to support universities, churches, hospitals. All those things rely on charitable support significantly. And I think news can be part of that equation with enough time. And I don't view this as a short-term thing. I think this is, a generational effort to have that conversation with people.
Local news needs new revenue streams, and my company, localpod.co, makes it easy and affordable. Our entry-level offering transforms your written content into high-quality audio and monetizes it with programmatic ads, all with zero extra work on your end. Think of it as a plug-and-play podcast solution for publishers. And if and when you're ready, we'll help you stair-step your podcast feed up to even more content, whether that's in-depth investigative reporting, interviews with community leaders, or whatever ideas you may have. You keep reporting, we help you turn it into new revenue. So you can get started at localpod.co, link in the show notes, or click the link in the show notes to set up a call with us today and learn more. Okay, back to the episode. Excellent. I love what you said something about just asking for people to donate to help the organization and everything. And I just recorded a podcast yesterday. If you're listening to this, it'll probably be live before this one airs. with a
So
guy
hopefully
named
people have heard it already.
yeah. And his name is a friend of mine named David LaFontaine, and he does he works with data and UX, the user experience. And what he said to me is what they have found time and time again. This is just a little tip for nonprofit or for-profit, whoever out there. When you're asking for donations or asking for your support, the bigger and the oranger of the button. He doesn't know why. That's what works. Put a big
There's a ton
orange
of
button.
science.
Yeah, it's crazy.
I mean,
It's
asking for donations is a scientific process. There's a number of times you have to ask. There's ways, the shape of the button, rounded corners versus square corners. I mean, there's a deep psychological science to it.
So anybody listening, this dovetails nicely with the podcast I just recorded. So go listen to that one also. So the second priority you mentioned was to become better at connecting with audiences, and you touched on this too. Any thoughts there?
Well, this is the harder one.
Yeah, it is. Agreed.
This is the much harder one. I mean, I think the good news is some of the things I talked about in the first bucket are absolutely applicable. Centering the audiences, having them, having your work provide benefits to them, that totally applies. But I also think it's a lot more than that. I look at what organizations like City Bureau did to bring people into the reporting process. I don't know that that's a slam dunk from an audience perspective, but at least it's trying something new. I look at what an organization like Outlier Media has done to bring information to people via SMS and sort of two-way SMS. And that, again, I don't know if that's the answer, but it's something new and different. So, I think we need to be in an era where we need to try different strategies and tactics for reaching and connecting with people. We live in a creator-driven economy. Paul, you're a creator. And so how do we work with more creators who are trusted voices in our communities to get accurate, vetted sources of news and information out into the ecosystem? So I'd love to see more experimentation with that. And then above all of that is we truly have to be for all the people. We, as an industry, have for a long time prioritize people who look like me. Middle-aged white guys, maybe bald. And we haven't thought so much about people of color, younger people of color, people coming up. And that, number one, is just wrong. It's also, number two, just a real business challenge in a country that is increasingly diverse. And so we have to make sure we're not just doing coverage about people of color, but for them and inspired by them and centering them. Not to say, that's all we do, but we have to really take into account the totality of the communities that we cover and ensure that those are all included. And I guess I'll say one last thing on this point. I was just at a presentation last week where Corona Research presented some research it did on the state of information in Minnesota, where I live. And they asked the public, and not necessarily news consumers, what they thought the biggest issue facing news organizations is. And far and away, the number one issue that people in Minnesota, whether they do or don't consume news, whether they do or don't pay for news, was the influence of owners of news companies on the coverage that news organizations do. And so if we're thinking about that's the big issue that people are worried about. How do we as an industry show up in a way that lets people know that we're for them? We're for the community. We are for the people. How do we let them know that news is driven by a set of values that center them? And so I think there are ways to show that. One of the things I love about the nonprofit model is there isn't an owner. That nebulous official or rich individual, there is that person doesn't exist. And the nonprofit's owned by the community, but that's not well understood. And so that I think is more awareness building. But I think this is one where there's a ton of work to do to make those connections and bring more people into the fold and get them excited about the positive impact consuming news can have in their lives.
Agreed. You're right. It's not an easy question to answer, but the need is there. Like I always tell people on this podcast, if you go look at like Google Trends over the last 20 years, the interest in like local information, it's never waned for a second. You know what I mean? So the need is there. Something else is funny. I was just reading this morning from Local News Initiative, I think, and they interviewed this guy. I'm blanking on his name. I think he used to be a Meet the Press co-anchor, and his whole take. Yeah, Chuck Todd. I was just reading.
Just saw his piece over the weekend.
It was awesome, and he was saying, that sometimes when local news outlets start up, they go too hard to get the news junkie, the person that's looking for news. And he was saying basically his first 3 hires would be a local high school sports reporter, a micro like weather forecaster, and a local like food person for like restaurants and where the cheapest groceries are. Because it's the stuff that people go into Facebook groups for now or whatever in their local town. But if you can connect with them there and then add in, the different journalism, and I think he said you can accidentally inform people and kind of back into the news junkie stuff. And I thought that was a fascinating idea. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, but the dirty secret of the news industry is that's always been the way it's been.
Right.
People picked up newspapers because of the package that was in there. They picked them up for classifieds because they were looking for a job. They picked it up for the sports section because they wanted to see, the out-of-town baseball scores from late after they went to bed. They picked up the newspaper because they wanted to see their kids' photo from the track meet that they competed in. Then they maybe accidentally bumped into that story on the front page about what the city council is going to do to their taxes.
Right.
I love Chuck's argument because when I was running a local news site 15 years ago, if my big innovations, if you could say there was one, was a relentless focus on weather, because people love the weather. I mean, I was in Kansas, Tornado Alley,
Right.
storms. I mean, the weather gods gave us on a regular basis, and it never ceased to amaze me how much people would want to, click on, comment on, engage. The streets would flood. I'd send someone out to take a video of street flooding and get thousands of views from people who just wanted to see the streets flooding. I mean, weather is a talker and it engages people, and it's not weather in a weather.com way. Like, it's not weather in like, I need my hour by hour. Like, that market's gone. It's taken by your iPhone. It's taken by weather.com, whatever. But it's the things that are happening in your community and how it might affect the things in your community. There's a storm that could affect the 4th of July fireworks down at the park this weekend. What's the rain plan? How do we, that's the stuff that local news can really do. And then, you talk about local restaurants and whatnot. There's a blog. That blog still exists at the newspaper where I worked, called Town Talk. That was entirely started by the gentleman who's now the editor of that newspaper. But when I was running the digital operation there, he was a reporter. We started this blog covering sort of primarily restaurants, but also other sort of like comings and goings and businesses around town because people want to talk about it. And so, I think those are the sorts of things that, number one, they're still mission aligned. You're still providing accurate, trustworthy, non-sensational sources of news and information. It brings people to the site, and then you can inform them. When I worked at that site, as I said, it was really well regarded. It had incredible market penetration. And so my goal there wasn't to increase market penetration. My goal was to increase habit, to get people used to coming back more often. For most news organizations, we need to increase market penetration and habit all at the same time. So, you've got a little bit of both and, but those sort of buckets that Chuck talked about are habit frequency drivers. And then you can invest in sort of deeper, long form accountability reporting that can also be there, and you can expose people to alongside this stuff that gets them there. I think that's all super important work to be done. And I think it's a model, or it's a part of the model, but I still worry that we will have a tougher hill to climb today than we did 15 years ago in getting people to engage with those that even the same way.
Wouldn't it be great to manage your portfolio on one platform? Well, now you can trade all in one place on Robinhood. That means you can trade individual stocks and ETFs and also buy and sell crypto using seriously powerful and intuitive tools at one of the lowest costs on average without needing to manage multiple apps. Robinhood makes withdrawing and depositing crypto seamless. Send crypto to your Robinhood account or send crypto from your Robinhood account to other wallets without deposit or withdrawal fees from Robinhood. Trade all in one place. Get started now on Robinhood. Trading crypto involves significant risk. Crypto trading is offered through an account with Robinhood Crypto LLC. Robinhood Crypto is licensed to engage in virtual currency business activity by the New York State Department of Financial Services. Crypto held through Robinhood Crypto is not FDIC insured or SIPC protected. Network fees may apply to crypto transfers. Crypto transfers may not be available to all customers. Investing involves risk, including loss of principal. Securities trading is offered through an account with Robinhood Financial LLC, member SIPC, a registered broker-dealer.
Great. Well said. Couldn't say it better myself. It's funny when you said how you were shocked at how well weather did at that site years ago and everything, how it gets people talking. I hate to admit this, but sometimes my wife and I will argue. We don't argue. We brag to each other over whose phone had the more accurate forecast for the day. Like, she'll be like, 30% chance of rain, and I'll be like, it's not going to rain. Mine says 10%. It's not going to. And then if it rains, she'll be rubbing it in my face later. It's
Well,
just
have you ever noticed that, like, if you have an Apple Watch and an iPhone, the forecast from the watch and the iPhone will differ, even though who
I don't
knows
get it.
why?
We have the same phone. We're in the same house most of the time. Different. Anyway, it's just, it's always of interest to people.
Absolutely.
So this podcast, some of these questions are kind of rhyming with each other. This podcast is mostly listened to people in local media, obviously, which is what we're talking about. Does anything come to mind specifically for smaller community outlets to strengthen whatever, the audience, the content? You had mentioned, I liked your metaphor of the churches earlier, how it only works down to a certain level. But just any thoughts
That's
on that?
a pretty small level.
Yeah. Yeah.
A few thoughts. Especially in small communities, I think bringing the community into the process is really valuable. One of the things I've enjoyed watching over the last 2 years is an explosion in nonprofit news organizations in Western Massachusetts. And Western Massachusetts has these relatively small towns that have, sort of a traditional sort of city council type setup. But then they have this sort of, I don't know how to call it, but the formal name is town meeting style of government. And they bring, like, I don't know, 500 people into a room to vote on, like, the budget. And that's
Wow.
like the official approval process. And so
Crazy.
these small towns in Western Massachusetts have a very participatory form of government. And I see many of the people who are interested in that also being interested in news and coming and wanting to be a part of the solution and wanting to be a part of providing information in their communities. And so I think, especially in small towns, bringing people to the table with proper editing, editorial independence, conflicts of interest policies, all of that, but bringing people into the process is a really important force multiplier for community outlets in small communities. So that's one. Number two, I'm bullish about the prospect for community events in smaller communities in particular. I just talked with a publisher in California who was running a small event that was going to look at the future of public transit in her community. So I think bringing the community closer is a superpower, but then it's also everything else we've already talked about. It's the weather, it's high school sports, it's restaurants coming and going, it's having the community at the center of the work that you do. I mean, there are things that I think apply up and down the spectrum. And then I think there are things that work better in smaller places and probably some things that work better in larger places. So some of it's a little bit tailored.
Yeah, it's one of those things. There's no one size fits all kind of solution to it. Agreed. But that's great stuff. I had a guy in here named Max Cabot down in Marfa, Texas. And
I love Marfa. Lots of great stuff happening in Marfa.
Yeah. So him and his wife bought the newspaper from the original or the former owners. I think they were retiring. And what they did, they took, because they had a giant print shop, and they took most of that print shop, went mostly digital with the journalism, turned it into a cafe and event space. And that kind of whole side like funds the journalism. And it's like, this is a tiny, tiny town, like less than 2,000 people or something like that. And it's a really cool story, Yeah.
One of the things, so the newspaper I worked for was in a college town of probably 100,000 people in a county of probably 130,000 people, smack between the state capital and a fair, a decent sized metro. So it was its own community, but also you could get to other things within probably 45 minutes or an hour. But that local news source, that newspaper and TV station were such a hub of community information in a way that I don't think necessarily happens in a big metro. And so I think, especially for local news organizations in small to medium sized communities, probably up to a couple 100,000 people, can be such a hub of community activity if done well. That there's a real opportunity for something like a coffee shop, like Coffee and News, go have coffee there. And if something happens in town, you're going to find out because you're where that, you're at that hub of information. Also, may just have good coffee and people may just want to hang out. And those quarters and dollars may go back to supporting the news. So yeah, I love what the Marfa folks have done. They have a really innovative public radio station in Marfa too. I don't know what it is about Marfa. I've never been, but something's in the water and in the air there. That's for sure.
Right. Yeah, it's very cool. So, we've touched on a lot. Actually, the last question I had, we pretty much already answered. Where you said the models are there, the people are not. Can you expand on that a bit? Well, you kind of touched on it a bit, but what do you mean by that line? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think to me, we need to spend much more of our energy on this stuff that you and I have been talking about for the last 5 minutes and less sort of subsidizing or innovating around new business models. There are business models that should continue to be refined and invested in and pushed, but I can't tell you how much time and energy is spent sort of either lamenting that the business model is not what it once was, or trying to find a business model that will be what it once was. When we have the roadmaps there, we just need to execute. We need to execute on connecting with more people and bringing more people to the table to make the business models we have more robust. And that we need to spend far more time on how do we bring people to the news? How do we connect with them? How do we rebuild trust? Things like that.
Well said. That's a great spot to kind of wrap on it. What else do you want to promote or point people to? What do you want me to link to in the show notes?
Yeah.
INN, I'm sure. Yeah.
INN is a great place for anyone who's interested in news. I'll also point to findyournews.org. It's a website that we run that points to other, it points to our members. You can sort by geography, by topic, search by keyword to find news organizations that you may not have heard of, but that may be serving a community, a state, or region near you. It's a great place to stop and think about. I will point to Newsmatch when we get toward the end of the year. If you're thinking about making some charitable contributions, Newsmatch is an end-of-year matching gift fundraising campaign that we run to help bring new donors and new dollars into news organizations across the country. So if you're trying to figure out, if you've listened to this podcast and you're a believer, you want to put your dollars behind the news, Newsmatch at the end of the year is a great way to do that. And then, as I look out on the ecosystem, I think of things like Trusting News, which is a project that's really focused on rebuilding trust in journalism. Then, INN, Lion Publishers, Local Media Association, these are all organizations that are working to help advance the state of the art. And I'm really excited to be a part of that.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I'll link to all that stuff. I hadn't seen the findyournews.org before. I just pulled it up as you were talking. That's a really cool tool there also. Yeah. I'll link to all that stuff and in the show notes and in the post that goes with this. So perfect. Awesome. Jonathan, thank you so much. This is great. I feel like we could do another episode or two about
I talk about this stuff forever.
Up. Awesome. Thanks a lot. I appreciate taking the time.
Thanks, Paul.
Yep. Thank you for listening to Small Press Big Ideas. You can subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to help the show, the best thing you can do is to tell a friend or colleague and just take a few minutes to leave a rating and a review on whatever platform you're listening to right now. It only takes a minute out of your day, but it really does help the podcast grow and reach more ears. Check back for new episodes every Monday.